Welcome to the dairies of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. Enjoy the journey. Elias stepped off the anti-gravity lift and immediately regretted choosing to wear the ceremonial robes. They billowed around him like confused clouds, tugging at the cuffs and making him stumble over the polished floor. Around him, the palace shimmered with an alien light, walls embedded with crystal filaments that pulsed in rhythm with some silent heartbeat, casting moving patterns across the crowd gathered for the selection gala. He had read all the etiquette manuals, 3 times, but none of them had prepared him for floating drones zipping past with trays of glowing drinks, nor the sudden, polite gasp of dozens of alien eyes when he tripped over the edge of a hovering platform. The alien women arrived with the elegance of predators unconcerned with spectators. Each moved with grace that was almost disarming, their long ears swaying with subtle gestures that betrayed emotion, from amused curiosity to mild disdain. One of them, a tall woman with silver hair and a faint aura of frost around her, shot him a look that could have frozen a starship's engine. Elias' stomach did a nervous pirouette. He reminded himself, "Don't stare, don't panic, and absolutely do not drop your drink." Of course, he dropped his drink. It floated in a perfect arc, glowing neon blue, and splashed harmlessly onto a decorative hologram which flickered and yelped in electronic protest. A ripple of laughter passed through the assembly, a rare crack in the palace's otherwise impeccable formality. Elias bowed sheepishly, though his robe had tangled around his knees, and muttered something about gravity not being his strong suit. The demonstrations began. Anti-gravity belts hummed as women leapt and twirled effortlessly above the crowd. Plasma blades danced between fingers like playful fireflies, some slicing holographic projections of alien wildlife in midair. Elias watched, jaw slack, as one woman, tall and white-skinned, performed a series of flips that ended with her standing perfectly still on a narrow beam, golden eyes flashing like twin suns. The palace murmured in reverence. He murmured to himself, "Okay, maybe I should have started with aerobics classes." Among the performers, one woman stood apart, not for showiness, but for the sheer intensity she radiated. Her silver hair fell straight like liquid metal, framing a face so sharp it seemed sculpted for command. Her ears were long, elegant, and tipped with a faint, iridescent shimmer. She didn't need to leap or twirl. The air around her seemed to hum with the promise of power, a kind of quiet authority that made other women glance away, half in awe, half in caution. Elias, inexplicably, found himself smiling. She looked dangerous, yes, but also human in the way she rolled her eyes when a drone buzzed too close, and the tiny smirk that crossed her lips when she caught him staring felt almost like an invitation. As the day went on, the palace shifted into organized chaos. Robots served floating platters of alien delicacies, while holographic displays projected starscapes and tactical war maps for some courtly reason no human was meant to understand. Elias, trying to keep his balance on a moving platform, accidentally triggered a minor alarm by bumping into a wall panel. The lights flickered, and for a moment everyone froze, then burst into laughter when the panel emitted a tiny, apologetic beep, as if it too were embarrassed. The silver-haired warrior raised a brow at him, unamused yet subtly entertained, and Elias found himself muttering under his breath, "First impression, not great. Second impression, maybe she likes my clumsiness." By the time the gala's first demonstrations ended, whispers rippled through the palace. Who would the human choose? Everyone expected caution, tradition, a safe selection that would honor centuries of ceremony. But Elias, heart pounding and robe sticking uncomfortably to him, found his gaze drawn repeatedly to the woman no one dared approach. There was a fire in her eyes, a confidence that made the carefully constructed palace hierarchy look fragile, almost absurd. And somewhere deep in the corner of his mind, behind the humor and nervous energy, a quiet thought took root. Perhaps he was meant to choose differently than anyone had ever expected. The floating chandeliers shimmered like liquid stars above, The hum of anti-gravity systems thrummed in his ears, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt the thrill of possibility, and just a touch of imminent disaster, looming deliciously close. Elias spent the morning wandering the palace corridors like a confused comet, trying to decode the etiquette that seemed to bend and shimmer like light through a prism. Holographic guides floated beside him, offering polite corrections in tones that ranged from soothing to faintly exasperated. Step 3. Bow at precisely 72 degrees, not 71, one chirped, and Elias muttered something about needing a PhD in alien mathematics just to survive a single greeting. Somewhere along the way, he tripped over a tiny gravity node embedded in the floor, launching himself forward in a graceless arc that would have been comedic if it weren't so spectacularly visible. It was during one of these pratfalls that he first properly noticed her, Liora. She was practicing combat forms in a quiet chamber that shimmered with anti-gravity projectors, walls rippling as if they were liquid. Each movement she made was precise, controlled, yet graceful, her long ears catching the soft glow of the energy fields. She moved like a storm contained in silver hair, her golden eyes sharp and alert, and Elias felt, without warning, the ridiculous urge to clap, and promptly tripped over a low bench on the way to the door. Liora glanced at him without expression, then raised a brow as if to ask, asterisk again. I'm testing gravity, Elias said weakly, trying to sound competent while dusting off his robes, which had acquired small stains of energy residue from the floor. Liora's lips twitched, not enough to be a smile, but enough to suggest amusement. She tilted her head and crossed her arms, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and polite judgment. The next few hours blurred into an odd mixture of observation, minor accidents, and accidental heroism. Elias found himself wandering into an exercise chamber where plasma orbs hovered midair, used for combat training. Naturally, he backed into one and sent it spinning wildly, narrowly missing a hovering instructor drone. The drone beeped angrily, then shot a small spark that, thankfully, hit a reflective shield and not him. Liora appeared at the door, silently shaking her head but did not intervene. Elias whispered, "I'll just call that a warm-up," and she raised a finger, an unspoken warning that he didn't quite catch. During lunch, the palace's floating dining tables became an arena for unintended chaos. Elias attempted to sample an exotic delicacy, a small glowing sphere that was apparently edible, and instead sent it rolling across the room like a comet, narrowly avoiding the feet of a cluster of dignitaries. Liora, seated elegantly nearby, flicked a hand, and a microgravity pulse sent the sphere spinning back gently onto his plate. "Next time, less enthusiasm," she said dryly, and Elias choked on a laugh. "She's serious, but she's also actually helpful," he thought, marveling at the contradiction. By mid-afternoon, the two of them were shadowing each other without formal acknowledgement. Elias was fascinated by how she moved through the palace. The way her long ears caught even the faintest signals of intent from guards, the subtle shifts in weight that suggested immense strength held in careful check, the way her golden eyes scanned rooms with analytical precision. Liora, for her part, found the human strangely persistent, slightly ridiculous, and oddly endearing. He asked too many questions, mispronounced important names, and seemed unable to navigate even the simplest gravity field without incident. But he did so with a kind of unflappable optimism that intrigued her. At one point, they found themselves alone in a balcony that overlooked the swirling clouds of the gas giant below. Elias leaned too far over the railing, prompting a quick step forward from Liora. "Humans," she said, voice flat but amused, as she steadied him with a grip surprisingly firm for someone of her lithe build. "We fall differently," he joked, trying to mask his nerves. She didn't laugh, not exactly, but the faint twitch of her lips suggested the smallest victory in humor. The day ended with the palace preparing for the evening's gala, where trials and demonstrations would continue. Elias, exhausted but oddly exhilarated, realized he was thinking about Liora more than anyone else, how she moved, how she observed, how her presence seemed to command attention without effort. He also realized with equal surprise that he had not once felt fear around her, only fascination and a spark of something curious, connection, perhaps, or the thrill of discovering someone who was both impossible and oddly approachable. And somewhere in the back of his mind, amid the floating trays, misfired plasma orbs and minor etiquette disasters, Elias understood that choosing her would be far more complicated and far more exhilarating than anyone could have anticipated. The morning air in the palace was thick with anticipation and the faint scent of ionized energy from the hovering platforms. Today was the first real trial, a test of courage, intelligence, and control over the palace's advanced tech simulations. Elias, still adjusting to the endless customs and floating hallways, tried to appear confident. He didn't succeed. His robe snagged on a nearby anti-gravity anchor, sending him spinning in a slow, humiliating spiral before he landed with a soft thump against the polished floor. The silver-haired warrior, Liora, observed him from across the chamber, arms crossed, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. Elias gave a sheepish wave, muttering something about practicing my orbiting maneuvers. The trial began with holographic projections of alien beasts, ranging from six-legged predators that could phase through walls to giant flying drones that emitted disorienting sound pulses. Each woman had to neutralize the threats while navigating a series of shifting gravity fields. Liora moved first, her body flowing like liquid steel, striking with precision, flipping in midair to avoid virtual talons, and dispatching simulated enemies with minimal effort. Elias watched in awe and mild panic, as her golden eyes seemed to calculate angles and velocities that would make any engineer dizzy. Then it was his turn. He pressed the wrong button on the control panel, sending a holographic beast careening toward the balcony, where it collided with a floating candelabra. The candelabra remained intact, the beast dissolved in sparks, and the crowd gasped, partially from relief, partially from amusement. "Nice approach," Liora said from the sidelines, her voice flat but carrying the faintest hint of humor. "Direct, chaotic, surprisingly effective." Elias blinked. "You mean lucky?" he asked. She tilted her head, and for the first time he felt as though she was genuinely considering his answer, not dismissing him outright. "Luck can be a strategy," she said, which he mentally filed under asterisk things to sound wise about later. The next phase involved combat with plasma orbs tethered to the chamber's ceiling, designed to test reflexes and adaptability. Liora danced through them effortlessly, each movement precise and seemingly effortless, while Elias quickly learned that his human reflexes were, at best, mediocre. He swung a training rod wildly, only to accidentally hit one orb in a way that sent it bouncing into a low-energy field, ricocheting unpredictably across the room. Chaos ensued. The orb hovered above an observing elder, wobbled, then gently floated back to the floor. The elder blinked and said nothing, but Elias could swear they were judging him with the most exasperated silence possible. Liora's smirk broadened ever so slightly. "Controlled chaos," she said. "You might have a future here or a concussion." By mid-trial, something unexpected began to happen. Liora started subtly altering the simulations to test him, not maliciously, but with quiet amusement. A holographic wall would shift just as he lunged, a low-energy pulse would redirect, or a gravity field would tilt at the exact moment he overbalanced. Each time Elias managed to improvise, sometimes succeeding spectacularly, sometimes failing hilariously but always learning. And each time Liora's eyes followed him, calculating, evaluating, and strangely encouraging. As the final challenge approached, a simulated rescue of a holographic civilian trapped in a zero-gravity chamber, Elias froze momentarily, then did something neither he nor anyone else expected. He leveraged his chaotic instincts, swinging along magnetic rails with a mixture of luck, timing, and sheer adrenaline, managing to reach the holographic civilian just as the system declared success. The crowd erupted into polite applause, the elders murmuring, and Leora's golden eyes glimmered with what could almost be considered approval. After the trial, as the participants dispersed, Elias found himself caught in a quiet moment with her. "You didn't have to make those small tweaks," he said, still catching his breath. Liora leaned against the wall, long ears brushing against the glowing filaments. "I didn't," she said, "but I wanted to see if you'd survive anyway. You're unpredictable, interesting, and possibly dangerous." Elias grinned, feeling a spark of pride. "Dangerous is my middle name," he joked, though the truth was he didn't have one. She merely raised a brow. As they walked back toward the main hall, the palace seemed to hum with possibility. Elias realized that the trials weren't just about proving strength. They were about testing character, wit, and courage in ways he was only beginning to understand. And somehow, despite the chaos and laughter, he knew that he and Liora were already shaping an unusual partnership, one that no one in the palace could have predicted. By the next morning, the palace had taken on the faintly absurd quality of a place perpetually on the verge of chaos. Rumors had begun to swirl almost faster than the floating chandeliers. A human had survived the trials, possibly by accident, and seemed to favor the fiercest alien warrior of them all. Servants whispered behind levitating trays. Scholars recalculated probabilities in holographic grids, and a few bored guards had taken to betting on whether Elias would trip over something before lunch. Elias himself navigated the corridors with a mixture of pride and trepidation, robes still slightly singed from an overenthusiastic plasma orb the previous day. Liora moved beside him, silent, controlled, a contrast to his frantic energy. Her silver hair caught the soft light of the ionized windows, ears twitching ever so slightly as she tracked his every gesture. She had taken to testing him subtly, arranging situations where his human instincts clashed hilariously with the palace's alien physics. A low-gravity corridor where he bounced like an overstuffed cushion, a set of hovering platforms that rotated unpredictably, a holographic map of the palace that insisted on floating away whenever he tried to read it. Each time Elias managed to muddle through, sometimes spectacularly wrong, sometimes accidentally brilliant. Leora's amusement was quiet but unmistakable, a dangerous glimmer in her golden eyes. "Human," she said once, arms crossed as he attempted to open a gravity-locked door with a stick he had picked up. "Your ingenuity is alarming, and possibly combustible." Elias grinned, ignoring the small sparks dancing around the stick. "That's my specialty. Improvise, survive, make people laugh while doing it." "Mostly the first two," she corrected dryly, though the corner of her lips twitched in the faintest smile. They entered the central hall, where the other alien women were gathered, practicing coordination with levitating weaponry and elegant maneuvers. The tension of yesterday's trial had faded into polite observation, though the underlying hierarchy remained rigid. Whispers followed them as they passed, a mix of admiration, confusion, and disbelief. Elias caught fragments of conversation. He's actually choosing her. No human could survive the selection without supervision. Does he even understand what he's doing? And made a point of grinning broadly at anyone who looked shocked. Liora didn't bother to correct him. The humor softened the edges of her fierce reputation in a way that surprised her. During a brief break, Elias attempted to engage the other women in conversation, which quickly devolved into chaos when he mispronounced the name of a delicate floating delicacy and accidentally launched it across the room. The glowing sphere ricocheted off a wall, narrowly missing a hovering dignitary. Liora, watching from a nearby platform, flicked her hand with effortless precision, redirecting it harmlessly onto Elias's tray. "Less enthusiasm next time," she said, tone flat but undeniably amused. Elias bowed sheepishly, muttering, "I'll try to restrain my genius." As the day progressed, Liora began to reveal subtle facets of her personality. Her humor, sharp wit and curiosity about this human who seemed immune to fear yet prone to spectacular accidents. She tested him with small puzzles embedded in the palace's simulations, some purely logical, some designed to trigger reflexes or strategic thinking. Elias responded with a mixture of guesswork, improvisation, and a surprising knack for unconventional solutions. Each time, he earned a faint smile or approving glance from Liora, small victories that felt monumental in the rigid, formal palace environment. By evening, as the light from the gas giant outside painted the hall in shimmering oranges and purples, Elias and Liora found themselves on a balcony, observing the floating gardens below. The palace seemed impossibly vast, filled with tech both beautiful and absurd, from hovering water features to plants that responded to thought signals. "You adapt quickly," Liora said, her voice softer than usual. Elias leaned against the railing, still feeling slightly unsteady from low gravity, and said, "I have no choice when I'm trying to keep up with someone who makes everything else look easy." For the first time, Liora allowed a small, genuine smile. "Perhaps you are more interesting than I thought," she said. The word carried weight, acknowledgement, and the faintest trace of curiosity that bordered on respect. Elias grinned, heart racing, realizing that the day's chaos, missteps, and laughter had drawn them closer in a way neither expected. And somewhere deep in the palace's shifting light and hum of technology, he felt that the unusual bond forming between them was no accident. It was, perhaps, inevitable. The day of the official selection arrived with the palace buzzing like a superheated plasma core. Floating banners shimmered with the emblems of centuries-old clans, and drones hovered in precise formation, casting kaleidoscopic light across the assembled crowd. Elias stood at the center of the main hall, robes adjusted, though still slightly wrinkled from his previous misadventures, and tried to appear composed. His palms were clammy, his stomach somersaulting in low gravity, but he forced a grin, reminding himself that humans were surprisingly adaptable, even when outclassed by golden-eyed warriors with ice-white skin. The alien women paraded forward, each exuding grace, strength, or elegance, and the elders observed with the scrutinizing attention of minds used to calculating probabilities down to the last decimal. Liora entered last, as if the palace itself reserved her presence for dramatic effect. Her silver hair gleamed under the luminescent ceiling, her long ears swaying ever so slightly with every controlled step. Her eyes scanned the hall with the cool precision of a strategist evaluating the field. Elias' heart did a disobedient flip. The entire palace seemed to hold its breath. The first few selections were predictable. Human allies, alien alliances, careful political considerations, all choices that made sense in the rigid hierarchy. Then came Elias' turn. He swallowed, adjusting the robe that seemed determined to tangle itself around his legs, and took a step forward. The elders' whispers rose into a crescendo of anticipation, speculation, and disbelief. All eyes turned to him. "I choose Liora," he said, voice louder than intended, which earned a few startled gasps. Some of the alien women raised their brows, the dignitaries stiffened, and one elder almost toppled from a hovering platform in shock. Liora's expression, however, remained unreadable. She tilted her head, long ears flicking slightly, and studied him with golden eyes that could have frozen molten metal. "You," she started, voice sharp, but the hint of amusement softened her words. Elias, sensing the tension, attempted humor. "Don't worry, I promise not to trip over your plasma sword, at least not today." Liora's lips twitched, the closest she came to smiling in public. The elders muttered amongst themselves, calculations running wild, while the crowd held a mix of awe and scandalized curiosity. Elias' choice was unprecedented, bold, unpredictable, and completely against every expectation. For Liora, the moment was a storm of conflicting feelings. Pride, disbelief, and an unexpected flicker of curiosity and warmth tangled in her chest. No one had dared approach her, let alone choose her as a partner. The fortress she had built around herself, strength, reputation, intimidation, felt slightly porous, and the human's clumsy, fearless sincerity was the key. She stepped forward, her movements fluid and deliberate, and extended her hand. Elias, fumbling for protocol but managing a dignified enough gesture, took it. A spark of mutual understanding passed between them, subtle yet undeniable. The palace erupted into controlled celebration. Drones projected streams of color across the walls, holographic banners danced with pride, and some of the more conservative dignitaries sighed audibly, as if they were mourning the loss of centuries of expectation. Liora guided Elias to a small balcony, overlooking the swirling clouds of the gas giant outside. "You have no idea what you've chosen," she said, voice low, a teasing edge hidden beneath her calm. Elias grinned, adjusting his robes with an air of practiced incompetence. "I think I do," he replied. "I've chosen someone fascinating, unpredictable, and maybe slightly dangerous." She regarded him in silence, the faintest trace of amusement in her eyes, and the wind from the gas giant stirred her silver hair. "Dangerous, yes," she said finally, "but perhaps not as much as you think." As the crowd continued their celebrations, Elias and Liora shared a quiet, fleeting moment of understanding, laughter hidden in tension, and the exhilarating awareness that this unprecedented choice had set them both on a path no one in the palace could have foreseen. Life after the choice had a rhythm that was both exhilarating and absurd, a mixture of palace protocol, floating obstacles, and the occasional unexpected zero-gravity mishap. Elias quickly learned that choosing Liora was not merely a matter of ceremony. It was a full-time exercise in surviving elegance and strength. The palace halls seemed designed to test coordination. Shifting gravity nodes, levitating platforms, and holographic projections that responded unpredictably to movement. Elias tripped, slid, and occasionally flew across corridors, each misstep earning a raised brow or subtle smirk from Liora, who moved beside him like liquid silver, her golden eyes gleaming with controlled amusement. Breakfast was a floating affair. Tables hovered at chest height, delicacies orbited gracefully, and utensils responded to thought commands, commands Elias was still learning to manage. He attempted to grab a small, glowing sphere of food, only to misfire the control link, sending it spinning in a perfect arc across the room. Liora, seated nearby with perfect composure, flicked her hand lightly, redirecting the sphere to his plate with a precision that made the floating fruit seem obedient to her will alone. "Controlled chaos," she said flatly. "You may have a future here." Elias grinned. "I prefer to think of it as culinary entertainment." The palace staff, scholars, and a few curious dignitaries were quick to test the boundaries of this new partnership. From etiquette lessons conducted via hovering holographic tutors to zero-gravity gardening exercises designed for meditative skill enhancement, Elias stumbled, improvised, and occasionally surprised everyone, including himself. Liora's role was often quiet guidance, a subtle adjustment of a gravity field here, a hand extended there, her presence a stabilizing force amid his chaos. And though she rarely laughed outright, the tiny smirks, raised eyebrows, and faint twitches of her lips communicated more than words ever could. Their interactions were not without challenge. Liora occasionally tested him in ways that were amusing and slightly perilous. One afternoon, a low-energy plasma orb drifted lazily toward him during a demonstration. Elias froze, unsure whether to dodge or deactivate it. Liora's voice cut through the tension. "Do something, human." He swatted it, sending it spinning unpredictably, which triggered a chain reaction of other orbs careening through the room. Instead of disaster, the orbs landed perfectly in their designated containers, leaving the instructors baffled and the observing dignitaries chuckling. Liora merely shook her head, eyes glinting, and muttered, "Surprising." Evenings were quieter, more contemplative. On a balcony overlooking the swirling clouds of the gas giant, they shared stories, his awkward attempts at humor, her reflections on life as the palace's most feared warrior. Elias discovered subtle layers beneath Liora's strength, pride mixed with insecurity, fierce independence tempered by unexpected curiosity. Humor became a bridge between them. When a rogue garden drone sent a cascade of glowing petals drifting through the balcony, Elias pretended to fend them off with exaggerated karate moves. Liora's faint laugh, almost imperceptible, caught him off guard, and for a moment, the weight of their unusual situation lifted. As the days passed, palace life adapted around their partnership. Skeptics whispered, but their attempts at disruption were countered by Elias' ingenuity and Liora's quiet authority. Through misadventures, playful challenges, and small victories, their bond grew stronger, not one of obligation or duty, but of mutual respect, curiosity, and an understanding that laughter, courage, and a little chaos could defy expectation. In the palace that hovered between tradition and technological marvel, the human and the alien warrior were carving a space that belonged uniquely to them, a space filled with unpredictable humor, quiet trust, and the thrill of the extraordinary. The palace was alive with a tension that made even the hovering chandeliers seem to quiver. Rumors had grown louder over the past days. Some ambitious dignitaries were whispering about undermining Elias' unprecedented choice. Normally, a human's presence was a curiosity, but now it was an inconvenient anomaly, a disruption to centuries of careful hierarchy. Elias, sipping a glowing beverage he had somehow managed not to spill this time, felt the familiar mix of nerves and exhilaration. Beside him, Liora's golden eyes scanned the room, sharp and alert, silver hair catching the faint iridescent glow of the ionized walls. Her long ears twitched slightly as she noted subtle shifts in the crowd, the gestures of palace guards, and the small hum of hidden drones. Without warning, the palace's security grid blinked red. A minor coup, or what the palace considered minor, though Elias thought otherwise, was underway. Dignitaries with grudges and a handful of rogue guards attempted to activate restricted systems, sending holographic alarms and low-energy plasma pulses into the main hall. Chaos erupted. Floating trays of delicacies spun through the air, holographic banners flickered unpredictably, and Elias, instinctively, ducked under a rogue laser pulse, accidentally knocking a hovering fruit orb into a control panel. To everyone's surprise, it triggered a containment override, neutralizing several rogue drones. Liora's lips twitched with the faintest smirk. "Controlled chaos," she murmured, and Elias felt a surge of pride. Together, they moved through the palace, navigating the zero-gravity corridors and shifting security fields. Elias, usually clumsy, now displayed a surprising combination of instinct, quick thinking, and improvisation honed through weeks of palace misadventures. He rerouted security nodes, manipulated floating barriers, and even cracked a few codes on the fly, all under Liora's watchful eye. She adjusted her strategy in response, providing subtle guidance, her movements a perfect blend of lethal grace and quiet humor. When a plasma orb zipped past his head, he jabbed at it reflexively, sending it spinning harmlessly into a wall, earning a glance from Liora that said both "well done" and "don't get too cocky." The rogue faction was contained, neutralized by a combination of Elias' unpredictable ingenuity and Liora's formidable combat skills. When the dust settled, the palace buzzed with a mixture of awe and whispered approval. Elias stood, a little disheveled but victorious, and realized something profound. He had changed. The human who once stumbled over robes, tripped on platforms, and feared every unfamiliar protocol had become someone capable of improvising under pressure, thinking strategically, and earning the respect of beings far stronger, faster, and more disciplined than himself. Liora, meanwhile, regarded him differently. Her fortress of pride and intimidation had shifted ever so slightly, replaced by admiration, curiosity, and something warmer, trust. She extended her hand toward him, and for a moment the palace seemed to fade. "You are Unpredictable, she said, voice carrying both amusement and sincerity. And perhaps exactly what I needed. Elias took her hand, smiling, feeling the odd, exhilarating sense that together, they were more than the sum of their chaos. The crowd erupted into cautious applause, some dignitaries masking astonishment, others conceding that the human and the warrior had proven a formidable partnership. Floating lights shimmered above, casting iridescent reflections across the polished floors. For the first time since he arrived, Elias felt entirely at home, not because the palace was welcoming, but because he had found someone with whom unpredictability, humor, and courage were understood. As the sun, or whatever passed for a sun in orbit around the gas giant, cast streaks of molten color across the hall, Elias and Liora stood together, side by side. There was laughter still lingering from minor mishaps, a faint hum of machinery, and the deep, resonant sense that their bond had reshaped the palace, the expectations, and even themselves. Tradition had been challenged, fear had been softened, and respect had been earned. The human and the fiercest warrior were no longer bound by protocol or hierarchy, only by the unspoken connection of trust, courage, and a shared, unpredictable sense of humor. For the first time, the palace and the cosmos beyond felt like a space where anything was possible. And for Elias, for Liora, and perhaps for everyone watching, that was the greatest adventure of all.